Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Cove Podcast. I'm Captain Todd Lemper, and in this episode, we're going to return to the Pacific, back to the Japanese thrust, but the purpose of this episode is to set the preconditions to talk to Sparrow Force by describing what it was like to deploy to Timor from someone who deployed there. We've talked a little bit about Sparrow Force in the series of episodes on the Australian forces in the Pacific during World War II. However, I have deliberately omitted a significant amount of detail about Sparrow Force in anticipation of today's guests, who I feel will become our resident expert on Timor-Leste. The idea of this episode is to talk through what would happen if we had to deploy into a Pacific or Southeast Asian nation, and all the things we want to know to be best prepared. Obviously, Timor is not the intended deployment location, however, it serves as an excellent case study. Our guest today is MAJ Guy Warnock. There is no better guest, but to qualify his opinion and why he's a Timor expert, he's just returned from years in the Defence Cooperation Program in Timor-Leste, living and breathing Dili and Timor more broadly. However, this is not where his interest in Timor started. MAJ Warnock is a Special Forces operator that deployed to Timor in the first few months of INTERFET as part of the Special Air Service Regiment. There aren't many episodes or guests that I go into, and I know for sure that we're going to do a subsequent episode. But I've done one of your history tours in Timor itself, sir, when I was over there, and it was absolutely phenomenal. This is the first of a 3-part series on Timor. This first episode being MAJ Warnock's infill into Timor with the Special Air Service Regiment. The second will be on Sparrow Force in World War II, centred on Swanbourne in West Timor and Dili in Portuguese East Timor. And the third will focus more closely on the Second Independent Commando Company, mounting a guerrilla campaign in the hills that surround Dili and Timor more broadly, which MAJ Warnock's decades in the Special Forces makes him uniquely qualified to analyse. Welcome, sir.
Thanks, Todd.
So I suppose the first episode, so if the idea is that we're going to deploy into our island nation to our north, and we pick Timor because it's an excellent case study and you know all about it. Before you went in on INTERFET, did you know, where did the interest start for Timor?
For me, it was, I knew about Timor. Unlike some of my colleagues who had to get an atlas out to find out where it was in the world. I think Australian soldiers have done that since the Boer War.
Yeah.
Trying to find Crete on the map or something before ending up there in 1941. I had a couple of incidents during my childhood or something. I had my first big colour book of war, and in there was that chapter about Timor, about Special Forces and about Sparrow Force and Z Special Unit. And so I took an interest in that. And but then as a young soldier, when I was about in 1991, when I was about 21, I'm in the battalion one day. We were sitting around the TV watching the breaking news of the Santa Cruz massacre in Dili, where Indonesian police and security forces opened fire on an unarmed group of Timorese protesters out the front of the Santa Cruz cemetery and killed probably 250. And that footage was smuggled out by a British-Australian journalist and was released around the world because up until then the Indonesian occupation had been largely suppressed by the military occupation, and the Indonesian government had sort of papered over a whole heap of things. And the Australian government, of course, had ignored much of what was going on. So one of the guys in the room at the time, in the brew room, sort of like took a sip of his brew or whatever and sort of went, we'll be there in a couple of years. And someone said, no, the Indonesians are huge. It's 150 million people and they've got T-72s and so on. And he goes, no, we will. I don't know what it'll be like. It might be a peacekeeping mission. At that time, there was or Namibia at the time, but soon to be Cambodia, Rwanda and Somalia. So there was a sort of a push around the world, I think, to be in these sort of military interventions, people like Bill Clinton and so on. So, and it turned out to be the case. It took a while for it all to be in place, and it took an Asian financial crisis and Brahmas Horta to be awarded the future president to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize along Bishop Bello. But we eventually got there, and before long, I find myself now a member of the SAS and on tag in the preparation for the lead up to Op Gold, and we start to see these events after the referendum, and again, it's clear that the world has sort of, I suppose, had enough of this of the treatment of the Timorese, especially after our World War II history, where the Timorese were great supporters of Australian soldiers on Timor.
Yeah, and I think just to I suppose get a bit ahead of ourselves, we're definitely going to do an episode on the Timorese support in World War II and Sparrow Force and some of the independent commando company elements in Timor itself. But before we get there, I want to talk to contemporary your infill. So how did you find out you were going to Timor? You talked about a building sort of, you must get signals throughout, just being like, I think where this is, I mean, someone guessed that you would be there in a number of years' time, and then you start to see more and more sort of noise about Timor and its independence. How did you find out you were going, and what was the original plan to go in?
So back to that thing where we were on tag at the time, and so the U1 squadron at SAS 3 squadron was on war rolls. They were on the hook to deploy, and to anything really. And we'd previously gone to Kuwait a couple of years earlier, and that was our call. One squadron went to a Pollard in Kuwait in 1998, and so we painted all our gear in desert cam and got our vehicles ready, and off we went.
A bright yellow,
really. We sort of took our best guess, and we got there and found this doesn't work very well.
Yeah.
And then we went on tag, and we sort of put all our sort of war rolls gear away, locked it in a trunk somewhere, and sort of got all our black gear on. It was great, and the Olympics was a great sort of training and operational sort of preparation. But it wasn't going to be us. We weren't going to go to Op Gold. 2 Squadron was going to go to Op Gold. So we're holding tag, and we're doing all the reconnaissance and the preparation and the venue sort of recons. They're still building these venues, and we'll have a chance to sort of crawl through air ducts and get up in light towers and bell towers and so on, and make sure we had everything in place for us for the tag for Op Gold. And then we hear from some of our colleagues in 3 Squadron, they're running around like pulling out their gear and saying something's going on, and then it was just a matter of listening to the news, listening to the ABC effectively, and seeing that the referendum that was underway in Timor for their self-determination, the popular consultation, had gone ahead, and of course the result was the lead up to it, I should say, there was a lot of intimidation and violence, and the UN had gone in unarmed, so United Nations police, military observers, and so on, and it was clear that there was a pattern of intimidation and so on throughout the island of East Timor, and that started a flag with defence. So then, therefore, it started a flag with SO Command. So we went on our merry way to our tag duties, and we heard that 3 Squadron had deployed to Tyndall, and then this is months before the eventual sort of arrival of INTERFET on the 20th of September 1999. So we're talking, even June, May, June, July, when the referendum, all the architecture for the referendum, all the UN workers were going into Timor, and there was already cases of people going missing and buildings being burnt down and so on. So that was in the media. We're getting this usually through open source media, but we're getting it through our own channels within SO Command, which is really good. So everyone was sort of thinking about it, but at the time, the focus is Op Gold and tag, and there's all our gear. I remember back in Swanbourne in trunks, all boxed up, not really worrying about that right now. So then it's clear after 3 Squadron goes in that after a while they'll be relieved and there'll be a rotation. So then we're doing 2 jobs. We're on tag. We're in Sydney. We're in the venues. We're going down to Melbourne to the MCG. It was a soccer venue, so for Olympic football, and we're doing all these things. But the whole time we're getting these feeds from what's going on in Timor.
This is imminent. And I suppose you knew at the time, maybe not what they're capable of, but so the Santa Cruz massacre, you had that in the back of your mind. You're like, this could, I suppose, did you understand the gravity of what could happen, I suppose? Or what were your thoughts on where it could go?
Yeah, so many of my colleagues were Bahasa linguists, and to do that they had a study tour, they had a relationship with Kopassus, and they'd been to Indonesia for their language study tours, often annually. And we had hosted Indonesian forces, as the whole of Australia did. We had Indonesian staff officers at Staff College and so on. So we sort of knew what was going on. But we also knew that sort of long history post-World War II, post the Dutch, who will appear in another episode, Dutch colonial rulers who were the first Australian peacekeepers or the first peacekeepers in the world, which were Australian, included Australians, going to the Dutch East Indies, and then Suharto sort of regimes, and how brutal they could be, the oppression of and the suppression of the communists in the 1960s. Like close to 1 million communists were rounded up and murdered in those years, sort of that time of the start of the Vietnam War for the Americans and Australians. So we knew we were up against, I suppose, people that might bend the rules, or local commanders might act rashly and they might act outside the law, which is what happened in Santa Cruz. That local commanders were blamed, people lost their patience or whatever and just lost control. And famously, the military commander or the military district commander in Dili said, "I told my commanders, if you're going to do this stuff, don't do it in public, don't do it in front of the media." So we all suspected that things would go pear-shaped. But probably the only thing there was that I remember that I'd saw some stuff from the Defence Library, because it was really before the internet, I guess. And they actually sourced the newspaper articles on microfiche, I think, and printed them out. So we could see this sort of, we just said, just find some stuff about Timor from the 1980s. And we found all these refugees coming by boat to Australia, reporting village massacres or, the Indonesian, whatever, all those sort of stuff, the way that the Indonesians were integrating, after they sort of suppressed as best they could, the Timorese resistance of Fretland, and fell until the military wing of the Fretland Party. Once they'd sort of pushed them up in the mountains, they then sort of, started to introduce all sorts of mechanisms of integration, education and healthcare and programs to introduce agriculture and so on, or different types of agriculture within Timor, so that the Timorese could, provide food into Indonesia, and the other states of Indonesia would provide them with it. So school teachers came from Sulawesi, came from Java, came from Bali, and the idea was that Timorese school teachers would go, or whatever, would go out to other parts of Indonesia, and that this strong sort of Indonesian sort of tapestry would occur. So we needed to understand that, and one of the best ways to do that was through the linguists. They had knowledge of the Indonesians. They spoke highly of them. They were great people. It's a great place to visit. But we need to understand sort of the way they work, and also the way that the Indonesian sort of, their integration, integrasi was, designed to bring the Timorese into the fold, and it hadn't worked over 24 years. The Indonesians suffered this quite high casualties from the Falantil fighters in the jungle. We were able to find sort of this information and sort of just read up, but really we're just passing articles, printed sort of photocopied articles around amongst ourselves. And it was what I did about SO Command at the time. I'd come from an infantry battalion where guys just sort of sat in the breezeway and smoked cigarettes and drank Coke and stuff.
Yep.
To a place where people, I was talking to a guy in the hallway one day, and he sort of tried, mate, he had an earpiece in and he had a tape recorder in his hand. He goes, I've got some tapes here from Bali, their Indonesian language. And it was like, took the earpiece out, and it was just some American guy going like, let's do numbers 1 to 4. And they, start to do a digger sort of, and he's just sort of saying this. So he's just walking up and down the hallway, just sort of talking to himself in Bahasa. He wasn't even a linguist. He was just wanted to learn Indonesian.
Yeah.
Everyone was mad keen. Everyone was always trying to seek out that information, and we did our best.
Get as prepared as you can, yeah. That interesting point is like so you spread from TAG. You've got one of the squadrons has got yellow kit from the desert. So now we're starting to talk about actually preparing ourselves to go. So what sort of, I suppose, how did that go? The preparations and I suppose mobilisation on a smaller scale. But how did that work?
Yeah, so in between activities for TAG, we'd go up to Bindoon with a lot of the live fire's done, a lot of the bush sort of stuff's done. But I remember we went out there and we're doing, so we're on TAG, but we're doing contact drills. So they'd sort of say, well, we're going to reconstitute from our water operator, land operator and sniper troops back into war roles of A, B and C troop or whatever construct for us it was, and back to our original patrol. So there'll be a little reshuffle. So we'd get together in our little group and say, and this guy here's going to post in next year. He's in the training job at the moment at Op Support Squadron. He'll be probably, in your patrol. So we're doing like, bush drills, contact drills, counter ambush, break contact, all that sort of stuff. But we did it in OzCam, which was some of it was brand new because we weren't using that stuff, and with this desert gear. And we have all these people come and say, like, just come in to watch the training. Someone from RSQ would come up and go, like, pretty good. What's with all the? You need to do something about this. That we know, all right, we're really busy at the moment. We haven't got around to painting our gear. Plus, we've got to use it. And then we'd go back, and then we'd go off on a CT exercise. Go off to, Melbourne or whatever and do a CT exercise. And then you come back and then we do some other sort of war role stuff. So we're sort of doing two things at once. And we're also getting some lessons learnt from 3 Squadron. So they were feeding back information, which was just actually, devoured. But I remember one day here's some points from 3 Squadron. It was just an A4 piece of paper printed out, and it just had all these dot points. Take your winter weight sleeping bag. It's cold up in the mountains. Yeah. Just things like that, just little nuggets. Yeah. So everyone did that, raced off and got their winter weight sleeping bag. Yeah. But it's the tropics. It's like, in Dili it's really hot, but up in the mountains it's cold, really cold. So that sort of preparation was, I suppose it wasn't ad hoc, but it was like we really came off TAG, had a week's leave or whatever, and then we left. We deployed. So we're packing trunks and we're doing that, getting all our gears. And we also, because we come off TAG, we go from our CT squadron sort of hangars and grots, as they call them, over to the War Rolls one, which is a smaller building and a smaller armoury, and you get all your weapons, change them all out, going from MP5 to M4. It's got to zero them, and some of them were painted desert colours, funny enough. And then that's when we started painting our gear. We've painted our gear now, and so some of the stuff came off the pallet in Timor and it was stuck together because the paint hadn't dried. It was that tight. I mean, the timings were really tight. I went to Bunnings and I took some Ozcam material and said, "Can you colour match, the pots, 1 litre pots of this?" And I was like, "Yeah, we'd better." And they did a pretty good job. So they were able to. Other guys just sort of got spray painted shit green and she'll be right. And then we're getting briefings, and then probably the biggest thing that I remember was we'd have reinforcements arrive. So people were coming off the reinforcement cycle they hadn't done certain courses, demolitions or whatever. It wasn't in Central, but they had to integrate into our teams. So now from team to patrol. So we're getting new guys coming in, making introductions, getting on a bus, going to Bindoon, doing live fire, doing DEMS, doing whatever we think is needed. And they'd just come off their patrol course effectively, so their bush skills were really good. Ours were a bit shaky. And all the time is like, we've got to deploy in 4 weeks' time or whatever. So, and then a new OC, new op staff, and then we get all these reinforcements. The squadron might be 70 during the year. When you deploy it turns into 100. So you get all these people that, what's this dude doing? It's like he's going to fill a role that probably should have been filled all year, but is now going to be filled.
5, 7, 2, 3 AC or something.
Yeah. And all necessary. In fact, we probably trimmed our squadron down based on the feedback from 3 Squadron.
You talked about being on operations, being busy all the way through up until that point. There's this, I suppose, the assumption for the conventional army was that the majority of army was like incredibly enthusiastic to go somewhere and do something. Right? Was that the same sort of that same level of enthusiasm throughout the regiment? We're about to do this. This is exciting. You talked about like a lust for learning or like really trying to get information in. Was that the vibe before you went?
Oh, certainly, yeah. I think so. And so there was another interest, as I was an anti-armour platoon in the battalion, so I had vehicle recognition skills, and someone had sent a photograph of an Indonesian armoured vehicle that was in Dili. So we went on this bent where I'd go to all these AFE lessons, how to recognise these vehicles. We thought they were there, someone had them, are they a threat? And then we started Bahasa lessons, so we just basic stuff, numbers, get down, stop or I'll shoot, that sort of stuff. So it was this, some of it was self-generated, some of it was like, without direction from higher, literally from the digger level, corporal and above, or all the diggers, someone saying, hey, and then one random fellow comes in and goes, I went to Timor a couple of years ago, my mum and dad went to Bali and we decided to go across to Kupang and we went over to Adambua and it's like, oh, wow. And it was like unheard of, it was almost like going into in enemy territory almost. But his parents were just like hippies or something. So he just got a chance to go there and say, what was it like? It's like, it's all right, a lot of landslides, that sort of stuff. So we're getting all that, that sort of feel too, the true sort of intelligence briefings, I guess, about terrain and so on. And then trying to pull in some history as well. So the commandos were mentioned. So I was able to find all those things from the Time Life series books that I remember as a kid. And sure enough, there they are. There's certainly in the regiment, there's always been that interest. This was like probably as close as we thought to warfighting it was going to be. Pollard sort of was what Bill Clinton's version of what George Bush did. It was to go to Kuwait and posture to invade Iraq if Saddam Hussein didn't give up his nuclear capabilities and declare his weapons of mass destruction. And he did. He let the UN inspectors back into those nuclear the researched sites, so the whole thing sort of de-escalated and we returned to Australia. So each of those things, I've been to Bougainville before that, and then this to Kuwait, and then now to Timor. So, and then Op Gold, was there was another operation that was going on, a very, very, very busy period, and we had individuals deployed also to UN missions, sometimes at the corporal level. Corporal Andy Russell, he was later killed in Afghanistan, and my squadron was he'd gone to the into the UN mission to Iraq as part of the UN monitoring team. I was a corporal. So it was great insights to when we went to Pollard, for example. So, so we drew on everything, anyone we could find who'd give us an insight. And it wasn't always generated from above. It was often generated at the troop level.
So you're incredibly enthusiastic and itching to get all of the information you can. You've got an arbitrary round brief from someone who went there with their parents for an awesome holiday. The Kupang we'll talk about sort of Sparrow Force in the subsequent episode, but there's a good link in there, I suppose. But so Do you think we're going in, you talked about prepping all your gear and everything, but do you think you're going in like kinetic action, or is there more of a, I know the first element that went off was unarmed and went through until INTERFET was called, but are you presuming that this is like a big, he's talked about close to war, is this like the big day? Is this the big show?
Yeah, we prepared for the worst case scenario. It was like everything from, 84, I think we took 84s, but, we some units were talking about whether they had, rules of engagement to use grenades or 40 mil grenade launchers, and it was like. And the other one was we had a big ROE brief about whether we could use claymore mines on delay, on an M40 initiator as a stay behind device, to break contact. And it was like no, because once you've set it, it's now a child could walk up to it and it's 40-second delay, and you walk away, you run away, and this thing's sitting there, and someone comes up to it, picks it up, and explodes. You have to be able to reserve it, so that do we reduce the time down? So you've only got 8 seconds or 10 seconds. So you've got to run and dive into cover. So all this, we went there. You say we need to carry claymores to destroy our equipment. If we're going to be overrun, we're going to put a claymore on top of our equipment. So we need them. And this went backwards and forwards. But we were prepared for that because again, even though the feedback from 3 Squadron was that after they'd gone in and sort of like the shock and awe of like landing helicopters on top of a militia sort of parade, which was largely local population coerced to stand there and wave Indonesian flags, that, once you rounded up the ringleaders, I guess, is that everyone was actually quite pleased to see you. And it turned out the Timorese were wonderfully welcoming and appreciative of our assistance. So it was like, well, it seems like a benign environment. You go to a village and you sort of creep up, you go through, you observe it for a couple of hours and you move in, and then you get welcomed by this crowd who love you. Yeah. It's like, well, if we missed the point here, it's all over. It was the sort of word we got, sort of all over. But you still have to prepare at that top level. You can't sort of reach back into your pack and get your grenades or whatever. Because for a while there, they did take the grenades off some of the battalions, probably about a year later. They didn't think they were necessary, or they were just I think they said they might be a bit of a risk, some soldier might play with it. And then it turned out there was a contact where the grenades would have been perfect for it. So they were promptly reissued. So, we went in expecting, phantoms of the jungle sort of stuff.
Yeah, and so obviously you talked about a staging field for 3 Squadron from Tyndall, but for you guys, I suppose, how did you get to Dili, and then first impressions? You talked about being welcomed by the population. I mean, they've been supporting us for years and years and years, decades and decades, right? But I suppose what was how did the infill go, and then what was your first impressions of Timor? You've heard about all these things, you've done all this research and stuff, you finally get there. What's it like trying to take it all in?
I guess I was a bit lucky. I was a bit older and I'd already deployed. I went to the UN mission to Cambodia on TAC in 92, 93, and I'd been to Butterworth, so the rifle company, Australian Rifle Company Butterworth in 1990, 91. So I'd done that quite hard, difficult bush, Palada in the jungle. So it's equivalent of Tully and Kanunga and so on. So to me, the actual country, the smells and all that sort of stuff was it was familiar. It was good. But the whole of Dili was destroyed. And everything was burnt out. And there was still smoke in the air. It was quite confronting, I think, and especially if you could see photographs of it before. But in that sort of build up, so our deployment, it was quite a rush session. We're still doing tag stuff. We did that handover as they do, the handover certificate. And it's like when we come off, they go on. There's a very brief period where weapons are handed over and so on, and then they're off. And then short period of leave, some pre-deployment stuff, and then more requirements, live fire, zeroing and so on, and then palletise, and then we're off. We're in Darwin before we know it. Flew up in service air. We got into Darwin. Darwin was actually logistically was working quite well then. There's a lot of sorties coming, a lot of aircraft coming in and out. And then, before we know it, we're on the back of a Herc, and we're flying in, and we're getting a handover from the 3 Squadron guys. So they'd started to thin out already, and moved into our accommodation, and we occupied a pilot's, like a fighter pilot's Marri quarter, I think. Those are probably helicopter pilots, and right next to the aerodrome there. The buildings are still there. I always wanted to go there and ask the residents if they knew the story behind it. And pretty much within days, we were in the field. We were out on patrol. We were on right out in the jungle for probably initially 8 days, I think, and very, very very, very challenging terrain. Black Hawk insertions. But we're also on the hook for, because we were a response force. So we were General Cosgrave sort of response. So we had the, one troop sort of allocated as a QRF, I guess, and then these long-range reconnaissance sort of patrols out along the border, that sort of no function, trying to get a feel. The feeling was that most of the majority of the militia had left, under fear of being captured or engaged with us. Many of them we know that were actually enlisted members of the Indonesian Army, various guises, whether they were Timorese or not. But quite rightly at the time we predicted that they would come back, that they'd go home for a period of reconsolidation, and then they know the Australians mean business. The Australians are prepared to use force or whatever, and then come back with an intent to be as disruptive as possible to the UN processes and the independence that the Timorese voted for, and then we're trying to implement in their own country.
I suppose when there was kinetic action, I suppose, at certain points, but there was an ambush the Indonesians ambushed a patrol up to the west, to the border. Did you sort of, I suppose, what was the feelings around that there actually did happen? It did definitely happen. Do you know what I mean? That the Australians were ambushed.
Yeah, so there was a vehicle ambush with the vehicle, the response force were escorting a truckload of militiamen back to the border to send them over the border effectively. And it was clear that the vehicle sort of slowed down and sped up and slowed down. And all of a sudden those vehicles raced off, and that was a signal to a force on the side of the road. It probably was the early warning as well. The early warning probably initiated the ambush, which they shouldn't have. The main force was probably further down.
Yeah.
So 2 Australians were wounded in that. One very lucky shot in the neck, passed between his sort of spine and trachea and his carotid and jugular vein, carotid artery, jugular vein. And another fellow, suffered, smashed his leg, never really recovered. So they still got 20 rounds off in his MAG 58 into the ambush. And then there was the Steve Oddie's patrol. I think it's been well documented. And that patrol was not only was it when it was compromised, I suppose it was compromised, it was clear that the Indonesians were stalking, they were moving around, so they made the decision to withdraw, but the force was split on either side of a re-entrant. But when the contact was initiated and grenades were thrown and so on, they didn't back down. I'd say the Indonesians, the militia, they were well trained and they were aggressive. They fought on. Despite suffering casualties, they didn't let up. Even the amount of firepower the Australians were putting down, they still persisted in trying to follow them up. So it actually showed the resolve of the militia or the Indonesians to fight in the right circumstances, I guess. And the case where I talked about helicopters landing on it, was one of the times where an SR, Special Reconnaissance Patrol, was watching an area and they landed like hawks, but there was also a cut-off. So as they tried to escape, they moved into the cut-off positions and it just completely discombobulated them, and they were able to round up the ringleaders and effectively take them out to Dili to be interrogated. So that, it never gave them a chance to sort of get settled. So they must have, in the end, I imagine what they did is they said, look, we're not going to succeed against the Australians. Let's go over back and reconsolidate and we'll come back. And they did, sort of by mid-2000.
I think that reconsolidation thing is there would be some people, I don't know whether it's 50-50, I'm applying an arbitrary ratio now, but 50 people thinking they're not coming back, we've done it now sort of thing. And then 50% of the people are definitely, you're in that camp, which were like, no, they're coming back. They're just it's a waiting game now. This is not over, and this is not how it ends. Sort of, yeah. What are the thoughts on? We're starting to get you. I suppose you're still sort of getting the lay of the land and still moving out to get some intel about the whole, and trying to get as much of the country now that you're there as you can. What's the sort of feelings about sort of coming back, the militia coming back?
So I got the impression that a lot of the captured weapons were those homemade weapons, a lot of machetes. So it looked like they weren't very well equipped. So maybe part of that was we're prepared to do this, we're prepared to come back, but you've got to give us something. You've got to give us an SKS or something like that. And there were weapons that were captured, the SS1 or SSV1, I think it is, the Indonesian service rifle at the time. But there was also other weapons that were captured that were, Japanese World War II, American World War II weapons, and a Bren gun. So maybe it was a matter of, a bunch of flag-waving militia that are just trying to influence the vote, armed with bamboo poles, smacking independence voters over the head or independence supporters over the head, all the way through to, if we're going to come back, we need to be better equipped. We need to have radios, we need to have camouflage uniforms and so on. And that was the case in that sort of 6-hour tour, I think it was, 2000, when response force was reduced down to MREC force, medium reconnaissance force, which is what happened to us. we were reduced, or I suppose we were extended, or some patrols were extended and become MREC 4 at 57 RAR's headquarters at Ballabo. So we moved from Dili, and the rest of the squadron returned to Australia. And then the other rotations, the people that didn't go on op gold or who missed the 3 squadron deployment, they started to filter in as patrols. And that's when it was apparent, that's when the militia, when they were, what probably happened was a couple of villages reported they were intimidated by, groups of militia armed with weapons, proper weapons, dressed in black T-shirts, cam pants, boots, brand new rifles, sort of stuff. It was like, righto.
Starting to get...
Yeah, so they've been re-equipped and the intelligence feeds that we're getting, from a whole range of, like, for the infantry battalions through to local people, and those relationships are being developed between the Timorese on the border area, providing valuable information back to the Australian battalion, which had moved to Ballabo, which is on the border, and that was a sector north, or the sector west was the western border with West Timor, and then the north and south sort of elements, the northern battalion and the southern battalion is NZ BAT for the New Zealanders and AusBAT for the Australians, and that pretty much Ballabo was the base for a while until it then moved down to Moliana, near Maliana, closer to the border again, and that sort of process, or that sort of lay down sort of continued for the next couple of years with every battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment rotating through at least once.
And I mean, like many people went, you just talked about that, and then all of the regiments going, all the battalions going, but yeah, so we talked about many of the battalions coming through and rotating. I suppose for those, now that it's somewhat a distant memory, but those people that haven't been to Timor, you're going out on these 8-day patrols. Sort of you talked about Tully and some Butterworth and the like. What is the actual terrain like? Say, if I was to go there tomorrow and we had to start humping around, what's it like?
Yeah, it's probably like Canungra. It's quite mountainous. It's up in the hill, but a big coastal area. The whole island, is probably less than 1,000 kilometres around the edge. There's all the various inlets. There's only 2 islands, but then it's steeply climbs. There's you don't have to go a couple of kilometres inland and you start to climb up into hills. Yeah, pretty severely. So, and then the top of the highest mountains like Mount Ramelau are quite cold. Yep, to the point of getting close to zero in some periods of time. So, and then you've got that sort of middle ground, I guess. It's probably at about 1,000 feet or something like that, and beautiful cool nights, warm sunny days, but none of that humidity. On the coast around Dili, it's really humid. It's like Darwin. So I think Canungra is a really good analogy. The top of trees and so on too. Many of it, and even when I was there with DCP, would drive around, you'd see like a eucalyptus type tree and quite clear underneath. So you could see for hundreds of metres on the side of this mountain. There was the coolness, a lot of that tropical vegetation had dropped away. You get closer to the coast and you got a lot more of that lantana and sort of weeds effectively. But up in the mountains, yeah, you can actually see for quite a long way. And then these rolling fogs and rolling clouds coming and actually obliterating anything and leading it down to 50 metre sort of visibility. So you're in an OP and you can't see anything. So, very interesting. I imagine it's very similar to, I have been to some parts of PNG, up in the highlands and so on. WEWAC, looking at WEWAC, if many people have served and been to some of the exercises, based out of Goldie River or WEWAC Barracks in PNG, and looking up from WEWAC up into the mountains is very, very similar to that as well.
So I've talked about the terrain or the ground or the lay of the land. As you start getting out, I suppose you're itching to get out on patrol to get into the actual country and see what it's about. But so you talked about, let's shift tack, I suppose, to the people and the language component. So you talked about the Timorese opening up with open arms to the Australians as they come in. Did you have any difficulties, or were there amazing moments where the cooperation between Australians and the Timorese just absolutely hummed, or were there difficult components? And an extension of that is, how did you communicate with them? Was it difficult and the like?
Yeah, so we were very fortunate is that, they do say the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, or maybe 10 years ago, but SASR in particular had gone on a language journey years earlier, in the early 90s, at least the early 90s, with probably their own internal strategic review, and we'd trained so many Bahasa linguists. So without actually massaging our force structure or bringing in anyone, we just found that every patrol seemed to have, well, besides people that spoke Thai and so on, but every patrol had a Bahasa linguist, and some of them were absolute top notch. So I'm still in the system, I know, and like these guys are like native speakers now. But that investment had been done years earlier. And of course it was really in a training role. We just interacted with the Indonesians in some sort of training. People went on holidays to Bali, I guess. But we made that investment. And the effect in the Timorese was that when the Indonesians arrived, they made the lingua franca. All business, all school education and government was in Bahasa. Portuguese was banned and Tetum was sort of frowned upon and you couldn't use it in school. So Tetum is has a lot of Portuguese in it, for example, from their colonial history. But anyone under the age of 40 spoke Bahasa. Anyone over the age of, say, 50 spoke Portuguese. And then there was all sorts of the local languages and all the local dialects. So the language was really key. And we would go into a village and they'd all come up. Hardly anyone spoke English. And then our Bahasa interpreter, Nev, start talking about any topic you wanted, including all the medical clinics we did. So, we're giving medical care, but of course what we're really doing is we're pumping people for information, aren't we? That's what we do. And he was then able to, one of the UN staff, for example, said, I'd like to speak to him about the process of what's going to happen next after the referendum. So we went to a burnt out sort of building, which used to be a administrative centre. Indonesians had destroyed. It was an Indonesian built one. So this Australian military observer, Unmo, he just sort of got up and just talked about that without any sort of like speaking to Nev about, this is what I'm going to talk about. He just started talking about, the government having to sort of lay down laws and to do this, that and the other thing. And, UN agencies doing these roles until the Timorese government's mature enough to take over. He just did it all off the top of his head. Very well received. The Timorese loved it. And what we started to do these patrols, we're doing special reconnaissance up in the mountains. It's Greenwood. We're camped up. We're hiding. We're pooing in plastic bags or whatever not.
Yeah.
At long range sort of observation and all sorts of other things. And we're doing these, I guess, overt patrols too. So we're heavily armed, but we've got all the vehicle skills because we've got free fallers, air operations, we've got water operators, we've got vehicle operators. So everyone's good for 4-wheel drive 6x6, and we're taking vehicles out to places where the bridges had collapsed in through natural disaster or wet season, through to being actively sabotaged. And we're able to get around them with our vehicles and visit these villages and pass these messages on. But of course, whole time we're trying to source information, and it was great because we could see that there wasn't. Well, it's funny. We went to a couple of meetings and someone just sort of like pointed to one of the guys, and he was sort of sitting there by himself, the Timorese fellas, and it was like I actually supported the staying with Indonesia in the referendum. But here I'm in the village, sort of. So he wasn't ostracised. He was just sort of on the outer a bit, but he could clear that he was a respected man. But that was his call. He thought the future was with the Indonesians. It was so important that firstly, that even though we're speaking another language, we're speaking Bahasa. We could just see firstly the Timorese were so welcoming and everybody to go, two chairs or a chair for everyone, a tablecloth, a pot of coffee, and a little tin of peanuts, which are often locally grown, would appear, and or betel nut or something like that. And I could see right from the start there all that stuff that I'd read about World War II and the Sparrow Force and the support the Timorese in East Timor gave the Australians, as opposed to the non-support that the Australians received in West Timor. On the Dutch side, different colonial masters, the Portuguese and the Dutch, was fascinating. You could see it. These aren't, and the Indonesian linguist would say that. They say, all my time learning Bahasa, these people are completely different. I might as well be in PNG or the Solomon Islands. These are not the same people. And so that whole assumption that was like, well, Timor was one island, we're just joining the island back up after a couple of centuries of colonial rule. No, these are different. You could tell. So the interactions were really positive, and also despite being with a tarp over an abandoned building, with a whole family living in there, the place was neat, clean. The kids were often well dressed, and on a Sunday, they'd all come out with their white shirts and best clothes. All the girls would be dressed in dresses, and they'd go to church.
Because it's not predominant. Like the predominant religion is Christianity. Is that correct?
It certainly is. Yeah. It's the most Catholic country in the world, other than the Vatican. They're 98% Catholics, and then probably close to 100% Christian. Yeah. Yeah. There is a little Muslim, still today in Dili, there's a mosque. There's a mosque that was built in 1958 in Dili. It's funny because, when I speak to my soldiers here in the unit, if they're of Muslim heritage or like a Indian heritage or Muslim background, they'll have a name often like Muhammad. But in Timor, they all had these like long Portuguese names, like Augusto de Santos de Silva, even though they were like the local imam. So they never sort of they just kept the traditional Portuguese names, even though they were Muslims. Yeah.
I think that Portuguese-Dutch comparison, but I think we're going to obviously talk about that in the next episode. It's going to be awesome. But I think before we do that, and to summarise the Timorese experience for INTERFET, infilling into Timor for the first time with the absolute excitement of the entire regiment behind you and trying to get in there and get it done, what were you suppose? I'd say 5 tips, but I think that's pretty arbitrary. But what do you wish you knew, or what do you wish people knew before they deployed into an island nation in the Pacific or in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think we've touched on it in part. And that is, commanders now at every level need to encourage their soldiers to get a language.
And I suppose some of those languages that, in the local region, they've got a huge return on investment. Like the amount of time you spend learning, you can learn a lot in a short period of time. Is that sort of the main argument?
Yeah, I think so. Like, Bahasa, Tetum, 3-month JDI, followed up by a deployment, or followed up, say, by regular interaction. I know we had some soldiers from 6 RAR that had done JTI, Tetum, 3 months, and they were in Brisbane. We sent a soccer team over from DCP, and we made sure that they got out and had a chat to the soldier. And they were amazed how much they remembered, because they'd done the course some cases years earlier. And the same with top prison, 1 month course. And then, but if you're able to follow it up with something like a deployment or a posting to DCP, if you have an interest in PNG or Timor and you want to continue it, then besides MTTs or in your units is corporals, NCOs, sergeants, engineers, infantry, or armed corps can be posted to DCP and then continue their language journey and their understanding.
And spend that time immersed in the culture, I suppose.
Yeah, that's where it comes from. I mean, you could spend 2 years studying a language, including trips to the target country, and then if you don't do anything after that, it'll slowly degrade. But if you do a short course and then are able to frequently go back, so I know in the past I've met guys who have been on MTTs and they've already been to PNG and they're likely to go back to PNG and Timor. It's like, it'd be good to settle on one or the other. Or if you had a specialist, if you had a soldier that was particularly gifted at it or enjoyed it, a corporal, is then career advisor sending them down the pathway of considering service in DCP, whether it be PNG or Timor. Yeah. Firstly, you can probably nurse some. So some of my soldiers here, over time when someone comes in and they've got an unusual surname, a non-Anglo surname, or different coloured skin or something like that, I'd ask them, do you speak another language? And often they say, I just speak it at home. Can't read and write. If it's a complex one like Chinese or Hindu or something like that. So, but I'll say get on the database or put it there. You never know. When I was in INTERFET, we had one of our troop commanders was an Italian heritage, spoke fluent Italian, and next door we had an Italian mechanised company. And we needed to do something or whatever, and he went over there and talked to them, and we got some amazing support out of these guys, and it was a really good relationship, but only through language. I was surprised how few Italians could actually, in that group, could speak English, despite being an EU country. And the same for that is, if you have a soldier that has an interest in, say, PNG, then get them on a top prison course and lay down that language early. Language leads to culture, and then culture leads to understanding. And if you understand, say, so we learn Bahasa, and we understand Indonesian culture, but then when you go to Timor in 99, you can speak Bahasa to a different culture, the Timorese, and straight away you understand these people are different. So we're always told, never pass your food with your left hand. It's dirty. Timorese care about that. And don't wave with your left hand. That's rude. In Indonesian, it was that Timorese wave with their left hand all the time. In fact, they used to do a thing where if they had a weapon in their hand, they'd change hands. They'd wave with their right hand. So it was, wave with a machete. So there was all these different things that we were told culture, but the way to get that was that our linguist, again, exhausted by the end of the day, his brain must have been steaming from the ears with the language, but he would sit with the kids or whatever, sit with the locals and just talk. And of course, we're getting information out of that, but also some of it was just an interest. They love football, they love soccer, so it was just all these different things, and that came through language. So if someone does a short course in TEDM, like a JTI, Joint Tactical Integration, try and get them on a MTT to Timor. There's other things too, like in Melbourne there's a good Timorese community. In Darwin there's a big Timorese Portuguese community that came to Australia in 1975 when the Indonesians occupied East Timor. So that's probably the first one. The other one would be, if possible, get your soldiers on things like Tully, get them to Butterworth, get them to Malaysia, get them into the jungle. But, that's because We could say the same thing about urban operations. We're going to fight the next war in an urban, think of somewhere like the Philippines, highly populated, Indonesia, more people per square kilometre anywhere, and so on. But there still is a need for that. People tend to be in urban areas, but they evacuate those urban areas and they become like a jungle type environment, with piles of concrete and so on. You think about the Ukraine. So if you can fight somewhere like the jungle, if you can fight in the jungle, you can fight anywhere. Because it's so much about being able to be comfortable in an uncomfortable environment. Having insects crawling all over you, and and also that indignity of being close to some other people while you do bodily functions and so on. And you get that through places like Butterworth, and you get on MTT. So there's only so much time we have to get soldiers ready. If you've been in the Army 2 years, you probably had those experiences, but you should just encourage them to try and get in there. And some of the other aspects, I think, for certainly places like Timor apply for all those other places. I think keeping people in command positions as long as possible. We were successful, I think, in all those deployments, and just about all I've been in, is because whenever we had a change in our force, or we had people posted in or promoted or something, it just seemed that there was like that. There was a very minimal disruption to an OC would come in. CSMs and OCs, so SSMs and OCs were always offset, it seemed. That was almost standard. Whereas I've been in many units where the COs and RSMs have arrived together, and OCs and SSMs have arrived together. So maintaining that sort of command, having that 2/3 of your command in place, and having those processes and SOPs and stuff and TTPs running, and the same down to all those other levels. People would be promoted out and someone would come in, and then some reinforcements would arrive, but it never seemed to be this big bolus of reinforcements, 20 people arriving in a squadron. So trying to keep your, especially your corporals, I think, trying to support them because they're relatively junior, keeping them together with the same people for as long as possible within reason. If you're going to move someone, try and keep as many people sort of in the same role as possible within their trade and within their experience, unless you're taking them out to develop them. And get them in a groove, get them into sort of into a pattern, get them to know each other, know them well. It's I've been on exercises, and I've been on exercises recently, where people are yelling at, hey, go over here, sort of thing. It's like, do you know that guy's name? It's like, no. You've been working together for 48 hours. You're doing live fire drills, and then it's like, Macca. You don't even know their name. And so I remember one time when I was at SFTC and we were doing selection, it was because we're now into training, I guess, training commandos, and they're doing live fire. I had to sit them down and got everyone to do it. 5 minutes now on each person, question and answers, over an hour, to know your people, and then try and keep those. But we wanted to either remove someone or move them around because they needed the support of another team, or there was a clash or whatever, and we didn't want to keep them together for, say, a week to let them know each other and then move them around. But that sort of uncertainty of command relationships and mateship, and that's where we get our strength from in teamwork. Yep. So really good soldiers parachuted into one little team that don't know each other. It's not going to be as effective as a bunch of average diggers who know each other well and trust each other.
So as that goes through, well, I suppose that the top three tips are that the language and leaning into a language. I think it's always paid off. Like sometimes school Langs postings are like it's seen as a secondary thing. It's like, no, you need to go and develop, language. So like, to use your example, language then to understand culture inevitably at the end. The second thing is lean into the qualifications you already have or the passions that you already have in your unit. Ask a few questions. You talked about familiarisation with your soldiers and the other people inside your team. Like, just ask, is anyone super keen on this? Or does anyone have like a lot of knowledge on this? You already had your own linguists and all that sort of stuff. And then that third one, continuity, there is a tendency to shift people. Like if we have tensions or you can't, you can't make it work, you just shift people around. It's like, that's not how teams work, and the continuity. They're awesome tips. Thank you so much for your time, sir. It's been absolutely awesome. That was, I suppose, Timor and Dili, the insertion for INTERFET. And then subsequently, I think the next episode we go back through the history to better understand that culture in East and West Timor. Thank you so much, sir.
No worries.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.